right. This week I have the opportunity to talk to basically make a new friend, and you're going to get to listen in on it. His name is Ben Houge. He works with Matthew Davidson over at Berklee, but he also has a pretty varied and interesting art life. And so what we're going to do is talk to him, explore his background, and get to know a little bit more about Ben. So let's start off by saying hi. Hi, Ben. How are you today?
Oh, I'm great. How are you?
I'm all right. Thanks a lot for taking time out of your schedule. I know that you're a busy guy. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
So let's kick off by having you tell me and the listeners a little bit about your work, your life and work.
Sure. Well, it's kind of variegated, I suppose, but my main thing these days is I'm working with chefs and creating music for dining experiences. That's been something it's been a concern of mine for probably about 10 years. I really kicked it into high gear the last couple of years with a series of events that I call them food operas, which sometimes perplexes people because singing isn't really the main focus, and a lot of people think of opera and they think of singing. But the idea that I was sort of trying to get at is the idea of putting things together. You know, operas being one of the most multimedia things that we have in terms of art forms. And so I wanted to draw attention to the fact that I'm putting music and food together and sort of highlight that sort of not so common connection. And the angle that I'm coming from with this is actually very much from my background in, originally studied classical music, writing pop songs before that. But most of my career has been in the video game field. So I'm actually treating the challenge of scoring a meal as kind of like a video game problem, in that you're responding to real-time events, and there's a lot of indeterminacy built into that sort of setting, where you don't know what somebody's going to order or when the dish is going to arrive or how long they're going to take to eat it. So I'm building real-time responsive music systems that can accompany the unpredictable events of the dining room. And in the process of doing that, I've been exploring the world of multi-sensory or cross-modal psychology, which is a growing field of research where people are looking at how the sense of sound affects your sense of taste, and also thinking of the meal as kind of a time-based art form, and getting into also some sort of ethnographic practices and trying to use sound to bring people closer to the farms that are providing the ingredients. So that's not a very succinct introduction, but those are some of the things that I'm thinking about these days.
Sure. Well, I don't know that I needed it succinct. But the concept is pretty amazing, and it leads to like about 100 questions right off the get-go. So what you're doing is you're not I just happened to listen to a podcast that Mark Maron did, and he was talking to a guy where they do this. There was some study where they were doing a pairing of like foods and sounds. You're not doing that. You're literally like scoring the experience of eating the meal. Is that correct?
Yeah, which touches on the former thing that you mentioned as well.
Right.
But yeah, it's sort of taking a big picture kind of dramatic narrative approach to it, but embracing it as also kind of a narrative that has nonlinear elements to it as well.
Sure. Well, that sounds really interesting. How do you find people who want to do this?
There are a couple of different answers to that. I've done different projects sort of on different scales. So the first large-scale event that we did was we did it at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. I'm here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so they're just up the road. There was a series that was looking at food and design that was going on there, and I was asked to be involved. And through that, we were put in touch with a very active and innovative chef here in the Boston area named Jason Bond. He's got a restaurant called Bondier, very well-regarded place, and he does really innovative things, very committed to just whatever's fresh that day. He writes his menus that day based on what's available, and works a lot with local farmers. And he's done a lot of stuff with Harvard's Science and Cooking lecture series, which is a series that they run every fall in conjunction with the class that they teach in the science department, but the lectures are open to the public. And so I think through his involvement with that series, where it's a fantastic series, and it's mostly recorded. I think it's available if you search for it on YouTube. Most of the public lectures, where they bring in some of the leading figures in the culinary world, and they sort of suss out the science and what they're doing as well. Usually they use it to talk about, soft matter and things like that, how, gels and suspensions and aeration and diffusion and all kinds of interesting things like that. And so through his involvement in that, we got put in touch, and then he was just very up for the idea. So we did one event at the design school here, Graduate School of Design, and then we did 2 subsequent events at his restaurant here in Cambridge, and now he has a second restaurant out in Concord. And then, so those are the first the big first 3 events that we did. The first one was in 2012. And then I've done a number of other events in just a range of different venues. The thing that I was actually was composing up until 15 minutes ago is a project that I'm doing with a new music ensemble in St. Paul, Minnesota called Zeitgeist. A venerable institution in the Twin Cities new music scene, been around for a long time. And so I'm writing a project for them, St. Paul Food Opera, and we're going to collaborate with a number of different chefs. And so that's been one where Heather Behringer, who's the director of that ensemble, has been doing the legwork since I'm not currently in Minnesota, working with the chefs. And so that's going to be, we've done a couple of sort of public workshops, one last summer, I guess it was January when I was out there, just sort of presenting the idea, giving people a little taste of the idea. And we're going to do another one here at the end of the month, and then do a larger scale event in October in St. Paul.
Now, the work that's played, is it classical instrumentation? Is it acousto-electric, or is it electronic, or what is the ensemble that plays this?
Well, it could be anything, because one of my key considerations with this is, so this was sort of the original spark for the idea, the sort of epiphany, was the idea that I was, so at the time I was working for the French video game developer Ubisoft, and they're headquartered in Paris. They have offices all over the world. Their largest development studio is in Montreal, and I was working at their second largest development studio, at least at the time, I'm not sure if it still is, in Shanghai. Okay. So I was living in China for 6 years, moved over there in 2004 to take this job with Ubisoft. So I was heading up audio it was a game called Tom Clancy's End War. It's in the Tom Clancy universe of, Splinter Cell, Ghost Recon, Rainbow Six. And so I was the audio director on that project, and I was devising a music system that would respond to the unpredictable way that the game might unfold. And this was a real-time strategy game in the Tom Clancy universe, there was previous games where, like stealth or third-person games or first-person shooters or whatever. So this was a different kind of approach with a particularly large amount of replayability to it, because the game could go a lot of different directions depending on your strategy, the strategy of your opponent. And so there were a lot more variables than in the other Tom Clancy games. So I was working hard to devise a particularly responsive music system. And I was at a restaurant in Shanghai with a French chef, guy named Paul Perret, who's was my favorite chef while I was living there. And it was just a really innovative meal that combined all kinds of unexpected things. It was like candied foie gras on a stick, and sardine foam in a can, and a lemon when you open it up. There's ice cream inside, and just really fun, playful, unexpected things. And I thought, well, we could. The techniques that I'm developing for this video game could just as easily be applied to this dining room. Sure. And at the same time, the feeling that I got from the food was that sense of sort of having to really engage your senses, because the food was so weird. It didn't give me I didn't have a lot of context to draw on. I had to really.
Right, of course. Like a Thanksgiving dinner, for example.
Exactly. Right. Or a barbecue or
right.
Caesar salad, you know. Yeah. So, and I found that very pleasurable because in my mind it was very similar to what I like when I go to a concert of new music, that I feel like I really need to pay attention and listen and see what is this connected to, because I don't have that context just handed to me. So those are sort of the twins' observations. The idea of the meal was kind of like a time-based art form, kind of like a new music concert, and then the idea that this video game music system could be used to solve the problems of scoring a meal because of the indeterminacy inherent in the sort of format.
Sure. Wow, that sounds really interesting, and it's interesting that you would make the leap from the video game to this food context. Although, you know, really the way that you were just talking about this Tom Clancy game really does sound like what happens when you're really around a great chef, which is that even if they do something similar, there happens to be a Thai restaurant that I like going to here. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes I'll order the same thing, but oftentimes it'll either be a change in the ambience or a change in the wine that I have with the food, or if I have a beer, the beer that I have with the food, or some change in the spices that are used that day or whatever. It's got that replayability, you know, it's not eating the same meal because mm-hmm. it's not the same experience. And that's really interesting that you would have made that connection. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and that gets at, in fact, I didn't really answer your previous question, but this is the answer to that, is that so I decided that to have music accompanying a meal, I wanted to sort of respect the tradition of communal dining, that you're there often with other people and you're having conversations while you're eating the meal. So I didn't want it to be something really austere where, you know, you can't talk, you have to just shut up and eat.
Sure.
And so I thought that the best way to achieve that would be to borrow elements of sound installation and to put a speaker at each seat and play the sound through a speaker. So it's all acousmatic sound. Oh. So there are no live performers, and that's sort of based on my own experiences. You know, when I hear live performers in a restaurant, I think of, you know, very common examples would be like in a Mexican restaurant, there's a mariachi band that comes around, and I love to hear that music. But I also feel like when they come to my table, I feel like I need to kind of put down my knife and fork and, you know, afford them the respect that a living performer deserves. And that those things I feel sort of interfere with each other, or either that, or there's a stage on the other side of the restaurant, somebody's performing, and that can be nice, but at the same time, it's very it's a different source of information than what's on your plate. And so I thought by putting a speaker as sort of the centerpiece of the table, like instead of a vase of flowers, you have a little speaker right there, and that brings the music. It places it as close as possible to the dish, so that the focus is on the plate. That there's not a stage going on somewhere else with something else you should pay attention to. But all of the focus is on the table, and the plate really becomes the stage for the performance. And so that's why the sound is all delivered through these speakers. And then the hard part is making sure that since everybody's listening to these speakers out loud, that it somehow blends together in a controlled way, that it's not just cacophonous and everybody's listening to different things. So there's a system in place that's coordinating. This is why it has to be a real-time thing. Another reason it has to be a real-time thing is that all of the harmony and the rhythm of all of these different speakers is being coordinated so that everybody's in the same, it has the same beat referential.
Well, that's really interesting, and I especially imagine the situation with the stage can be weird because not only does it draws everything away from what you think of as an intimate and wonderful meal. You know, whether you're sharing it with someone else or, in this case, sharing a performance with other people, drawing your attention to a stage is like the opposite of what you'd want to accomplish, right?
Yeah. I saw actually a textbook example of what I want to avoid last summer. So I've been teaching at Berklee. This is my 5th year at Berklee. The first 2 years I was teaching at our campus here. I was teaching in the film scoring department, actually. We have a video game scoring minor that I was brought in to help out with. Okay. And then the subsequent 2 years, I was teaching at our brand new campus in Valencia, Spain. And so I just got back from Spain last fall. Now I'm back and I'm teaching in our electronic production and design department here with the same department as Matthew, as you mentioned.
Right.
And so over those 2 years in Spain, so living in Valencia, last summer I got over to Ibiza we actually went just for a weekend for my wife's birthday. And there's a new restaurant there, which is a collaboration between Albert Adria, who's the brother of Ferran Adria, who's one of the big famous celebrity chefs, El Bulli, and known for just a lot of pioneering innovation in the world of gastronomy. Mm-hmm. So, and his brother is also a very active entrepreneur and restaurateur, and I think his background is maybe pastry chef. I'm not sure about that actually, but they have launched a collaboration with Cirque du Soleil in Ibiza called Heart. Or Heart Ibiza. I'm not sure if you're supposed to call it Heart or Heart Ibiza. But we went there last summer, and because it's a collaboration with Cirque du Soleil, there are a lot of theatrical elements. And yeah, you can
I can see where this is going.
Yeah. And it's really, it was, so the food was great. It was really great. But the environment, it was two totally different things mashed together. Right. There were performances going on the other side of the room, and what they would even do sometimes is they would dim the lights, totally asynchronous with what I'm eating, because everybody's eating, asynchronously as typically is the case in a restaurant. So, I'd be enjoying a dish, and then the lights would dim. It'd be this sort of lurid blue light on whatever I was eating. And then there would be a performance, dancers would come through the aisles and do a little performance. And then the lights would come back up and my food would be, that much colder. Right. And just totally at odds with the meal, like totally out of sync. So it's sort of, in a lot of ways, the opposite of what I'm trying to accomplish, like trying to use technology to enhance and focus and follow the rhythms of the meal.
Right. So how much of a foodie are you?
I'm a foodie.
Sounds like it. I mean, you're very thoughtful about it, and I was just curious how much you would consider yourself that.
It's a huge world, and it's I do my best to pay attention and do research, but there's more stuff coming out all the time, and so I try to stay on top of things, but there are so many developments. It's gotten to be such every month you see a variation on this headline that, that chefs are the new rock stars. Right. So there's just a ton of interest in this world, and I just love to follow it and love to just see what's coming out. But increasingly you see people other people doing things with music and food, or this like the Cirque du Soleil thing. Probably one of the most well-known examples of music and food pairing is Heston Blumenthal at his restaurant, The Fat Duck, in Bray, England, about an hour, I think, outside of London. And I've been out there, but the restaurant was actually closed for renovations, and he sort of decamped to Australia for most of the last year. So I actually gave a presentation to the research and development staff there about my work last April. So they were working on researching and planning the grand reopening of the Fat Duck, which has now been open for a couple of months, I think.
Okay.
But there's a famous dish there called the Sound of the Sea, which I think was developed in 2007, so this goes a ways back. And it's a variation, it's a seafood dish that is sort of rendered to look like a slice of beach. It looks like foam on sand, and it's made out of different kinds of seafood. It's a very complicated dish. I've actually got his cookbook. And it's served with a conch shell that has an iPod in it and headphones protruding from the conch shell. And so you put on the headphones and you hear the sounds of the ocean and or the seaside. And I've heard a clip of this at a presentation. He worked with this psychologist at Oxford called Charles Spence, who's gotten a ton of press for his work in sort of cross-modal psychology.
Yeah, I've heard of him, yes.
Yeah, fascinating work. I gave a presentation to that group as well on that same trip, or actually subsequent trip. No, previous trip. Anyway, last spring, about a year ago. And just really fascinating to see all the work that they're doing He's got a book out too, which is just a wonderful compendium, of a lot of this research. But that's something that I thought about. People often ask, well, why don't you use headphones for your project? And headphones can be something that are it's a way to really put you in a world. You're really enveloped in a world of taste and sound, and that can be a really powerful, poignant, nostalgic experience. But I feel it doesn't really scale to a whole evening length experience. It cuts you off from the rest of the dining room and from the people that you probably came to the restaurant with. Right. And let alone just sort of being uncomfortable if the food opera events that we did here were like 2-hour, maybe more experiences. And I just don't think I would want to be listening to headphones in a restaurant for 2 hours.
Sure.
And actually a variation on that. So I haven't experienced the sound of the sea, but I have experienced another dish that involved headphones, which was a crazy collaboration between the performance artist Marina Abramovich and a pastry chef named Kevin Lasko, I believe, at a restaurant called Park Avenue Winter in New York. I think it was 2011 or so when that came out. And it was a similar type of thing. There was a nice little box with an iPod in it, and you put on the headphones, and it was Marina Abramovich describing the dish as you consumed it. And so she was, I'm not going to do my Marina Abramovich accent, but it's crunchy, cold, burnt, all of these ideas that would sort of draw your attention to different aspects of what you were tasting.
Right, sure. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is exploring people's backgrounds. And I'm a little curious about what kind of background you have. What was your journey to become the artist that you are, especially since it's clear that, you're doing video game audio, you're doing composition for this very specific kind of thing, but also clearly well-versed in generalized music production and music development. Berklee's not going to take you as a food audio expert, right? You have to have a really broad set of skills in order to pull that off. How did you get where you are?
I think it's maybe not ridiculous to trace it back to my upbringing. I had a very international upbringing, and I think that introduced me just to the idea that there are different ways of looking at things very early on. I my folks are missionaries. So I was born in Nebraska, and then a little bit of Milwaukee, and then a little bit of Ohio, and then moved to Southern California. And that's when I started kindergarten. So moving around quite a bit. And then for 6 years while I was growing up, we lived in Liberia, West Africa. Okay. And I went to boarding school in Ivory Coast and got a little bit of also sort of learning. Liberia has never been a colony, but has close ties with the U.S., but Ivory Coast was a French colony, so another culture there as well, not only different African cultures, but also different colonial cultures. I think that experience of just moving around and living in different countries, growing up, just kind of opened up my mind to the idea of keeping an eye out for different ways of looking at a problem. So I grew up didn't really have a strong sort of classical background, although I studied classical piano for a bit while I was growing up, but started fiddling with keyboards and synthesizers in sort of junior high school, and writing little pop songs. Also singing in church choirs because of that. So it was a Lutheran church, so we lay claim to Bach and that tradition. So growing up around a lot of that great stuff. And so then I went to St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, studied classical music. And of course, there's a strong choral music tradition there. And actually, I still write a lot of choral music. But that's also where I started doing computer music for the first time, doing some C sound and just using a computer to do sequencing or digital audio editing. And then so after graduating from St. Olaf, got a job at Sierra, the pioneering video game company. So I was there for 7 years. It was right after they had moved their headquarters from California to the Seattle area. And so I lived in Seattle for 8 years. That's the longest I've lived in any city. And then the second longest I've lived in any city is Shanghai, actually. So I moved from there to China in 2004. And while I was there, so took the job with Ubisoft, was also active in the art scene while I was there. Very interesting sound art scene, a lot of people doing noise music and things like that. So I played on a lot of the shows. And probably around that time that I started doing more, like when I was living in Seattle, I had some friends that I would work with, and we'd put on shows, and it was a composers collective, but we did sort of, some of the stuff was more kind of maybe performance art oriented. And then when I got to China, I was separated from those collaborators, so I started doing more with sort of laptop performances. And I had been using Macs for maybe 2 years before that, but that's when I really got into using Macs for a lot of like live real-time stuff. And so I started doing more. For a long time, I had thought of my work in video games as a kind of virtual sound installation. And so I started getting involved in actually taking these video game organizational concepts and applying them to physical spaces. Audio behaviors that could continue indefinitely, that had some type of generative or responsive aspect to them. And then ended up in the Boston area about 5 years ago, actually following my wife, who was going to grad school. And then ended up teaching at Berklee coming up on 5 years ago. And that's another interesting story of how I got that gig, which is maybe illuminating, although maybe a little bit of a tangent. But I can share the story.
Let's dive in.
So most of the time that I was living in China, my parents were living in Kenya. As I mentioned, they were missionaries with the Lutheran Church. And I went to visit them with my girlfriend at the time and my wife. And while we were visiting for a few weeks, we decided to pop down to Tanzania. Neither of us had ever been to Tanzania. And it turned out there was a big music festival going on the island of Zanzibar. So we went to Zanzibar for this. It's called Sauti za Busara, which is, I think, Voices of Wisdom in Swahili. It was mostly East African music. And there was a great band from Ethiopia that played one day. And at the end of the day, I was at one of the local bars, and I saw the band from Ethiopia. And I just went up and started talking to them and saying, hey, really dug your set. And it turned out that the trombone player was a guy named David Harris, who teaches at Berklee. And that was right when we found out that we were going to be heading to the Boston area. And he said, well, if you're going to be in Boston, I was telling him a little bit about my background in video games. He said, there are people who might want to know about that at Berklee, since they've just started this video game scoring minor. So when I got to town, I gave a presentation there's this monthly video game meetup where people just present on their work. So a different person presents every month. So I shared a little bit about my work on N-Word, Ubisoft. And I invited the guys that he put me in touch with to come along. And one of them, my colleague Michael Sweet, showed up, and I guess he liked my talk. He invited me to come talk to his class. So I gave a presentation to his class. And then over the summer, they said, hey, you want to teach at Berklee? And I said, okay. So I love telling that story to my students, because I didn't start talking to these guys in the bar because I wanted a job at Berklee.
Right.
It was because I was really into their music.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I try to tell people, is just to, put yourself in the situations where you're going to meet the kind of people that you want to be around. And by showing a genuine enthusiasm and curiosity, I think that leads to stuff.
That's a great story and some great advice, because I think a lot of times people think that these kinds of career decisions or these kind of career arcs come from very calculated movement through a career trajectory. And they don't realize that most often it's because you happen to become friends or friendly with somebody, and on a fluke that turns into a career path.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And, there's people often say, well, it's who you know. But it comes down to the fact that you can get to know people, right? It's not like you're born with a set of connections or something, but just, right. Getting out there. And for people, and a lot of my students want to get into video games, and increasingly just all over there are communities of people who are just interested in that kind of stuff. There'll be local game industry meetups like this Boston Postmortem that I mentioned, or composer groups or things like that. And just, going to these things, just kind of showing up and getting to know people and work on the connections and making friends and show a genuine interest in it rather than just trying to look for the job. And then a lot of times those opportunities will just naturally emerge.
Sure. Now, one of the things I want to kind of dive into just a little bit because I'm curious about it. As you've talked about the different paths you've taken, one of the things that you've talked about is having the opportunity to speak to a pretty crazy variety of folks, So you go to this famous restaurant, you talk to their R&D staff, or you go to a place and you speak to, whomever, scientists or artists or whatever. You seem to find yourself in a position to have like these talks to people. How do you generate that? How do you make it so that, first of all, you find the opportunity to talk to people, but secondly, so that you get an interesting group of people willing to listen to you?
Well, I think it's good to just not be inhibited about talking to people. The Oxford connection, and also through that, the Fat Duck connection, came through a friend of mine, Janice Wong, who did her master's here at MIT at the Media Lab. And she also helped out on the food opera events that we did here. So now she's doing her PhD with Charles Spence at Oxford. And so while I was living in Spain, she said, why don't you come up and give a talk? And while I was in town, we did a wine music pairing at a local wine bar. And then as I was leaving, I was speaking with Charles Spence, and he said, since you're in Spain, you should swing by this conference that's happening next month. It's called Diálogos de Cocina, which was happening in San Sebastián. So I was over in Valencia on the Mediterranean coast. San Sebastián is sort of North Atlantic coast, Basque country. And I'd never been there, been dying to go. And this was a perfect excuse, and it worked out with my schedule. So I flew out, and it was like a 2-day conference. And the theme for this, so San Sebastián, that's the city with the highest number of Michelin stars per capita in the world. It's a real epicenter for gastronomy. You also have sort of the, over on the other side, sort of north of Valencia up in Barcelona and Catalonia, that's where El Bulli was, and a lot of great chefs there as well. But those are sort of the two hubs in Spain. So this conference was called Diálogos de Cocina, Dialogues of the Kitchen, and it was hosted by this new institution. It's been around about as long as Berklee's campus in Valencia, called the Basque Culinary Center, and a lot of the leading chefs of that region are on the board of this Basque Culinary Center. So there was a lot of those chefs are also involved as sort of hosts of this event. And one of them is a guy named Andoni Luis Aruriz, who is the chef at Mugaritz, which is currently, for the last 2 years, has been ranked the number 6 best restaurant in the world. And he was one of the most sort of visible faces throughout the conference, just sort of on panels and welcoming people. And the theme of this conference, it was a culinary conference. It was called, the theme of it was La Vanguardia, so like the avant-garde. And there were talks on what is next for technology in restaurants, what is the history of the avant-garde and the arts, and how does this connect to the history of gastronomy? So it was a very forward-thinking conference. And as an aside, most of the conferences that I go to are like, I go to the web audio conference or I go to the game developers conference. Those are 2 that I was at just earlier this semester. Tech conferences or game developer conferences where you get, maybe stale coffee at the coffee breaks or, pastries out of a box or something. And at this, every coffee break was just like, sample this artisanal ham from our local provider. And
right.
How would you like a glass of this fine Rioja? And it was amazing. I just thought, never want to go to a technology conference again. But throughout everybody that I spoke to, the coffee breaks or whatever, everybody said, oh, you need to talk to Andoni. He's really into, when I would talk about the work that I'm doing, they're like, oh, he'd be really into this. And there was really no way for me nobody wanted to introduce me to him, or I guess nobody knew him well enough. So at the end of the second day, I just kind of walked up to him, and my Spanish is not so great. It got better while I was there, but not super fluent. And so I just kind of walked up to him, and in my best Spanish, I was like, "Hey, I have this project, maybe is interesting to you." And so he was curious, and I just sort of showed him a little bit of I think a video of what I had done, and showed him some of the software, and he was like, "Hombre, why didn't you tell me sooner?" And he invited me to come back and give a presentation to his R&D staff last summer. And then I also had a chance to meet up with him and some of his other chefs that he works with when he was one of the invited lecturers at Harvard Science and Cooking Lecture Series last fall. So I gave him, after he had given his presentation there, I invited them to Berklee, and I gave them a tour of we just built some new studios, and showed them some of our facilities. And that was something where it was just, so partly just deciding to go to this conference where, initially it might have not seemed like the obvious place for me to be, but then also just being, I think just not having any inhibitions, because you realize that people, are curious. People are, they like to learn new things. They like to talk to people. And I think just having that realization has allowed me to be willing to chat with people and, not be shy about meeting folks.
Right. Now, this is really interesting you say it that way, because one of the things that a lot of musicians talk about is the seeming disinterest in the general public about music and musicians, right? Mm-hmm. And I would tend to agree. There's every performing venue is chock full of people performing music. And as a result, it can seem like, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that you've cracked something there, and it reminds me, or it makes me think of an experience I've been having. My experience is that I started doing visual art for a dance company, right? And, the idea of interacting musically with dance is obvious, but doing video art in conjunction with dancers has been really amazing. But all of a sudden, it's like people are really interested, and these people want to talk, and they want to talk endlessly. And then they're like, "Oh, and you do sound too? And does the sound work in a way similar?" And it's like, because it's this very focused interest area that's not musical, the idea of bringing music, and it's not visual arts, and so bringing visual artwork into play all of a sudden becomes very, very interesting and very exciting for these people, in a way that if I'm just like saying, "Hey, I'm going to play, ambient music in a bookstore," everybody's like, yawn.
Exactly.
And so there's something about finding these very specific and kind of peculiar contexts that seems to really open the door for music to be appreciated, and maybe appreciated in a completely new way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think there's certainly many sides to this question, and I can totally identify. I've been to a lot of concerts where I think the music's absolutely fantastic, and why isn't anybody else here? Mm-hmm. So, and there's definitely, I see this also even from people, you see the visual arts world has increasingly embraced sound and sound art as sort of a part of that practice. But even a lot of people working in that area seem to like the idea of sound more than they actually like the sound. I don't know if you've observed that too, but
yeah, I do.
So I totally see that, and it is, there's also, the observation that contemporary art is hot and sells for zillions of dollars, and contemporary music is like, oh, I don't know, maybe there's something on TV tonight,
Right.
So I definitely, that's a complicated problem, and I definitely see that side of it. But I think that what you're suggesting is absolutely right on, that there are ways to tie that to other experiences. I think that one way out of that impasse, if it is an impasse, is to look at how sound can be linked to other media. So whether it's dance or, for me, linking it to food has been a great way to do that.
Well, I would say certainly, though, too, during the time frames that you were working on video games, that was a real transition time where game audio was becoming much, much more sophisticated as well. So even in that context, you were bringing sound art and musical arts and kind of like pushing the envelope in that world as well.
That's really true. I really see like a lot of the early first couple of years that I was working in the game industry. I mean, this was like, I started in the industry probably a few days shy of, maybe a month shy of 20 years ago was when I started in the game industry. And it's been a very interesting time because when I started in the industry, it was right around the time when computers were fast enough to play back relatively high quality digital audio, multiple streams of it, mix it in real time. Right. And that started to open up a whole new sort of category of things you could do with sound in a computer game. And Sierra was primarily focused on computer games more than console games. Right. And so for a lot of the first couple of years in the game industry, I was really, like, it didn't take me long before I realized, oh, hey, this John Cage guy that I studied in school actually has a lot to do with the way that we author sound in this inherently indeterminate medium. If you can't make a video game without incorporating indeterminacy. And rather than just trying to think about, whoa, what do we do with indeterminacy? You can actually look and see that there's quite a history of approaches and solutions that people have found to these problems. How do you structure something in an environment where you don't know how long that it's going to last, or you don't know what's going to happen next? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the early days of my work in the game industry were trying to look to, John Cage or to, Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11, which is the one that has the form that's basically kind of a web page that you just go from one cell to the other arbitrarily, and see how we can incorporate some of those models into a video game music context. And then more recently, my work has been about how to get ideas from the world of video games and take them out into a broader cultural arena. And so I think with sound, so you can think of sound as having become very devalued, as partly as the way that the media that we use to disseminate and consume sound has changed. So if you think of going from sort of LPs to CDs to an iPod, and to the point that a track would be reduced to just a line on a screen, and then I thought that was sort of the nadir, and then I realized that now we don't even have that. People are listening to anonymously curated playlists, and people don't even know who they're listening to.
Right.
So it's even less than a little line on an iPod.
Yeah.
And so I feel like part of the reason that it's interesting to connect music to other art forms is because it gives it that sense of immediacy. It gives it something that you need to really be there to experience in a kind of authentic way. If it's not too cheesy to say, authenticity, but it's something that, you can, it's routine. You can have either, through a streaming service access to 30 million songs, or you could have a huge hard drive of all of your favorite MP3s or whatever, but you can't download a meal for later.
Right.
You need to be there. And so that's a way to reintroduce that sense of immediacy and that sense of urgency and the importance to really be there in the moment, to experience it when it happens into the music. So whether that's through collaborating with dancers, as you mentioned earlier, or whether it's through collaborating with chefs and having that sort of something that hits you from a couple of different senses that gives you really a reason to be there.
Well, Ben, I could talk to you for hours. There's a lot more that I would like to dig into, but we've kind of hit our time allotment on this. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I want to make sure that you and I get a chance to catch up in the future, because I think we have a lot more to discuss.
Absolutely.
But before we let you go, why don't you just let people know where they can go to find out more about your work?
Oh, sure. So I have a web page at www.benhouge.com. That's BENHOUGE.com. And that'll pretty much point you in the right direction for other stuff. I'm in the process of putting together another website that's more about this food opera project, but that's not live yet. On the Zeitgeist website, they've got information about the upcoming St. Paul food opera, and that'll be part of it in May, another part of it in October. And hopefully soon we'll be announcing another one in the Boston area as well. But there's stuff up on SoundCloud. There's stuff sort of scattered around. So probably my webpage is the best bet.
All right. Sounds great. Well, thanks again for your time and for your work. It sounds fascinating, and it's really exciting to think about, again, opening people's minds and opening other artists' minds to the idea of interacting outside of the typical context. I think it's way too easy to say, well, I'm a musician, so I got to go play in a club, or I'm an artist and I got to go hang stuff in a gallery. Yeah. I think it's really fantastic to think about the variety of places where this artwork can exist and kind of coexist with other fabulous art. So
yeah, I think that's so important. Last summer I taught a class at Berklee's Valencia campus that was all about the technology behind the Food Opera project, and the students were in our music technology program, so they were learning Max programming, and I was showing them some of the techniques that I use to generate music or to respond to these events. And the point of that class was not so much that I thought they were all going to go out and write more food operas, but it was just to get them thinking about, well, what else could I attach my music to? What other possibilities are out there? So yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing to encourage people to do.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, and we will talk again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Okay, many thanks to Ben for hanging out and talking about the intricacies of doing audio and doing composition for foodies. It seems like a really exciting way to go. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for keeping on tuning in and turning other people onto the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com. Other than that, I will catch you soon. Bye.